What's up? It's Rowan here from Artist Smart Education, bringing you another episode of the weekly HSC Economics Stats Update. In this episode, we're doing a deep dive on all things economic growth and unemployment. The ABS just released the national accounts for the last quarter, so we've got lots of new data to look at GDP, consumption, investment, income, and more. We're going to be looking at how this impacts unemployment as well in the economy and using it to analyse fiscal and monetary policy effectiveness and the macro policy mix. Now, if it's your first time dialing in these episodes, I summarise the key stats from around the domestic and global economy, giving you the key insights you need for the HSC Economics course to help you unlock that Band 6 result. So let's dive in and look at today's data. So what we've got here is we've got the ABS quarterly accounts. Now we can see that GDP grow 1.5% over the 2023 to 24 financial year. Now, if we dive in, though, we're going to see some little bit of different data points. We'll see that, June 23 to 24, okay, it only grew 1%, so that's obviously lower, which tells a slightly different picture. And then on top of that, as we've been highlighting in prior weekly updates, our actual GDP per capita is really going backwards, and we can see that here. We can see that it's, June 23 to 24, it's gone backwards by 1.5%. So in other words, what this 1% tells us, what this 1.5% tells us is that is only been possible due to population growth, right? So GDP per capita, we're going backwards. What that highlights, therefore, is our living standards are going backwards because, we've got less economic growth per individual that lives in Australia. Now, why is this happening, right? What's driving this, okay? Well, of course, the quarterly data was, very anemic, only 0.2%. Now, note, to get into a recession, you need, successive quarters of negative quarterly growth. So, at 0.2, we're obviously not in the negative in any way, but we're obviously getting closer to it, right? And if we go and look at, quarterly, we've now really been sitting for the last 3 quarters at 0.2. So in other words, we're really just like edging it, if that makes sense. Edging, okay? And so this is the argument that, Jim Chalmers has been making in terms of the fact that, we're on the, cusp of maybe a recession. He hasn't said those words because he doesn't want to from a political perspective, but certainly his arguments to say that, the RBA is smashing the economy, right, and really squeezing growth with the high cash rates that we've seen, right? And we can see that that economic growth is continuing to be anemic. Now, to put this in context, right, the 1.5% that we've seen over this financial year, the ABS says it's the weakest annual growth, of course, excluding the pandemic, since 91-92, right? Now, note, that was a year that we were coming off the back of a recession, okay? So in other words, right now, if we really place this current economic growth in context, it's one of the worst economic growth, figures that we have seen outside of COVID in almost, 30 plus years, basically. Now, what's driving this? Well, ultimately, subdued household demand, no surprises there. What that really shows is that the cash rate changes are working, right? They are working in terms of really driving down household demand, which detracted, 0.1 percentage points from GDP growth. While at the same time, right, the government, and this shows arguably the role that fiscal policy is playing in supporting economic growth at the moment and keeping us above, the sort of recession line, right, or that zero, negative economic growth for the quarter, because government consumption contributed 0.3 percentage points, right? Which is the same contribution to growth as the prior quarter. So we can really see here in this data both the impact that monetary policy is having in really trying to shrink household demand and really limit inflationary growth, but as a result it's doing so through really driving constraints on economic growth, but at the same time how the government and fiscal policy is at the same time supporting the levels of economic growth we're seeing in the economy. Now, let's jump in. And The Guardian over the last week have had some really fantastic analysis around, this data that's come out. And we can use this to further evaluate the policy effectiveness. So the first thing, to highlight is, well, what was the rate of economic growth compared to? So you can see that, GDP grew 1% compared with the June quarter of 2023, right? That rate was compared to 0.9 predicted by economists and 1.1 predicted by the ABS. So I think economists are always a little more pessimistic. You can certainly see the ABS had thought we were doing better than we were, and it highlights that, this growth result was a little worse than expected. Now, equally, right, we can sort of see and appreciate, right, that, this is creating an issue, right, particularly around GDP per capita. Now, I know I'd said we've obviously been talking about this in prior weeks, right? The Guardian has some really great data here, right, that really highlights that, okay, this has extended a record retreat that began at the start of 2023 that goes back to 1973. So in other words, like our per capita GDP contraction is at some of the worst it's ever been since 1973. Okay, so we've got two things going on. Like GDP growth was the lowest since 91, 92, right? And we're really seeing that this retreat in GDP per capita we haven't seen since 73. Okay, so we can really see that there's some real concerns there. Now, if we dive in and look at a little bit more analysis that the Guardian has put together here that I think you can really use. If we take a little bit of a look, right, like and this goes to evaluating monetary policy. Like monetary policy, particularly in the last sort of meeting, it highlighted, look, we're still holding firm because we still are not happy with where inflation's at. It is coming down, but it's remaining stickier than we wanted to, and we're not seeing it get into the target really until late 2025, and that's probably too long because it's going to let inflationary expectations continue to set in, and we really want to avoid that. Okay, so the RBA said that really that they were still concerned about the degree of excess demand in the economy. Now the argument here is when we see these economic growth figures, it really suggests that that's not true, right? That's really not true. Particularly, we said household spending, right, fell in the quarter. Okay, and so it's really showing that there's not that excess demand, and maybe the data is showing that monetary policy does need to make a change because maybe it has been going too hard, and that's been one of the criticisms we've had that you can raise in your analysis around monetary policy is that obviously everywhere else around the globe we've seen in terms of Canada and the UK and the EU. And the US, we've seen like a movement towards like rate reductions, and the RBA still held firm. Okay, now there's some really great visuals that the Guardian put together here. Okay, and this shows GDP growth, which you can see is like certainly on the lower end if we look at really going all the way back. Okay, like certainly the last time we've had 1.5% growth was exactly there coming out of the recession. Okay. And then the time before that was 77, 78. So this is some of the lowest economic growth rate we've ever had. Now, if we then go and look at GDP per capita, growth as well, you can certainly see that, we have a couple of little periods, right, where it's gonna appear, but it's sort of sitting at 1% at levels that are again close to the recession and the recovery from the recession that we had in 1990, 1991. So some real concerns there, okay? Now, this is particularly the case as well if we look at it per capita for the quarter, right? And you can see here that trend across the quarter, okay, which is obviously particularly concerning, right? We're not really seeing a shift in that. Obviously, we saw some during COVID, makes sense, some recovery, but this is starting to become almost the new normal, which is very, very concerning. Now, once again, another great data point here to just show that what's contributing to economic growth, and this is something that I highlighted, which is a real positive that you can use in your fiscal policy analysis, which is showing that, on a quarterly basis, right, and this is the government, but if we look at it on an annual basis, okay, we can see that the government, right, is playing, households are playing a role in contributing to the small amount of economic growth that we've seen. But we are seeing that, government is playing a really critical role there. Now, obviously, net exports are not. That's actually being a drag effect on economic growth. But we can use this to, positively highlight, okay, that the government is and the fiscal policy is having a real key role. Now, note this highlights here as well, which I think is really fantastic, right? And we can see that certainly at like a quarterly level as well, right? That the private sector is going backwards. Okay, so household spending in this quarter backwards, right? Business investment and trade all have been going backwards. Okay, overall, if we start to sort of look at the big picture, and so what this is really highlighting is that the government is really the thing that's keeping us out of a recession. Okay, and this is exactly the commentary that the Guardian has here as well. Okay. Right, and the reason that the private sector is going backwards is because of the interest rates, okay? So we've got a really clear sense of the impact that both fiscal and monetary policy are having. Now, this shows, just the increase, right, in interest payments payable by households, and you can see that they're at really near record highs, right? Like, we're at a point here which is almost at the level of where we were at 2008. Now, note, at the back of that, we had a housing market crash, right? That was because of the GFC, of course. But you can sort of see, okay, great, we're at real highs. Now, note, of course, we got used to a period, between 2018 through to 2022, arguably, where we had, lows that we hadn't seen for a period since the early 2000s. Now, the concerning thing in all of this is that household living standards do remain at 2014 levels, okay? They are not, like we've gone backwards, right? I think that's the absolute reality. We've gone backwards because of one, inflation, but we've also gone backwards because GDP per capita, right, has also, been going backwards as well. And so you can see, right, that here, right, that takes us back to, I mean, look, of course, it's also 2017, right? But it does take us back almost a decade. And so this argument that what we're seeing, the net effect of all of this is we're, really a decade behind, okay? Now, final bit of analysis I want to share before we wrap in today's update, and this is what are the implications of all of this for the labour market and unemployment? At the end of the day, labour is derived demand, and so we're going to see some impacts here. And there's some really fantastic analysis here that you can certainly use to really level up into a band 6. There's some really great things here. Now, the first thing that we want to really highlight is that, Deloitte, right, dropped a real sort of big suggestion that the lack of hiring among companies in terms of the private sector was consistent with the rise in unemployment that would put us into recession territory. So in other words, as I said, 0.2, 0.2, we've been edging just above recession, right? We're not there, amazing. But what Deloitte's saying is, look, if we look at the labour market, that's almost like the canary in the coal mine. It's telling us that a recession's on the curve, on the cards, and then maybe this is the criticism that monetary policy is not going to get the balance right. Now, if we go and take a look here, right, a really key bit of insight here is something called the SARM rule of recessions, okay? Now, this is the idea that ultimately, okay, what happens is that, and this was created, I should highlight, by an economist, Claudia San, who created the rule, who argued at the time, right, and you can see this here, that when unemployment rises by 0.5% in a year, it's historically meant a recession is coming. So, if you look at the data and you see, fairly quick increases in unemployment, it tends to indicate, okay, the pendulum is swinging, and when it completely swings as a result of, economic growth slowing, we're going to see that we're in recession territory. Now, the problem for Australia, as The Guardian highlights, is that we're at 0.49 percentage points, right, for the year, right, which is obviously so close, 0.5. So we're just a little bit below, right, which is crazy, crazy scary if we believe that this rule is a good predictor of recession territory. Now, as this graph highlights, right, the change in the 3-month rolling average, right, of unemployment highlights that we're seeing, a fairly rapid increase, okay? Now, again, this is the argument, this is the point where, 0.5% is when you hit, recession conditions. And so you can sort of see, obviously, right, like rapid increase, boom, hit a GFC, right? Rapid increase, like arguably we weren't really in like a recession during that post-GFC austerity, but clearly, economic growth did slow, right? Obviously during the pandemic. So it's not like a perfect rule, but you can certainly see that edging up does start to indicate a pattern that may show that we're going to be in we're going to be, potentially be seeing a recession unless fiscal policy, monetary policy change. Now note, are we headed? This is the exact point, right? The point of this rule is to prevent a recession. The point is to give reserve banks, governments, right, the insight that they need to identify, okay, we've got to make a change in policy, right? Now, why maybe is this not going to be as big of an issue as we think? Well, and this is fantastic, again, if you're needing data for unemployment and its impact on different groups in the economy. Okay, this article has amazing data that shows, although if you're under 35 not, that mostly that's where unemployment has risen, okay? Unemployment has been rising, and you can see this, right? The uptake, here from 12.7 to 14.6 for 15 to 19s, 5.1 to 6.5 for 20 to 24, right? 3.4 to 3.8 for 25 to 35. So you can see that the bulk of the growth in unemployment is really hitting young people, and that's not surprising. Whenever there is a recession or, you're in downturns in economic growth, young people who are lower skilled and have less experience tend to get hit first in the labour market and tend to find it harder to find work, and they tend to be more likely to lose work. And we can see that here again in that the rise in unemployment has mostly hit young workers, and we can see that particularly here if we look at the 15 to 24-year-olds, we can see that they always have much bigger peaks, okay, during periods of, recession conditions, and certainly you don't get as much, from a 25 to 65-year-old. They still have increases, but it's nowhere near as much as that younger area. Now note, you can see that prime age employment remains strong, so there is some real positive here overall, which indicates again, okay, maybe this is a more complex picture, okay? So there you have it. Overall, we've got a bunch of really fantastic data points that you can utilize in your analysis for the HSC Economics course. Ultimately, I think the key takeouts here would be number one, okay, economic growth is perhaps some of our worst ever, okay, which, highlights, okay, great, maybe monetary policy has gone too hard. Unemployment is teetering, right? It's growing very quickly and indicating that we may be in recession territory as well. And so what this highlights is, okay, maybe you can be quite critical about so far monetary policy stance at the moment in the economy, but you can be very positive about fiscal policy's role, highlighting that is the thing that is keeping the economy above a recession. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I will see you next week with our next weekly HSC Economics update.